Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
A landmark federal court decision has hit Qantas with Australia's largest workplace penalty in corporate history. The airline has been ordered to pay $90 million for illegally sacking more than 1,800 workers during the pandemic. Money that comes on top of a $120 million compensation deal that the airline has already agreed to. It's been nearly 5 years since we first began hearing about this case, and there have been plenty of twists and turns in the years since. So today we are going to take you through everything you need to know about this case, including this week's ruling.
So, Em, this is being described as the largest case of illegal sackings in Australian history. That is not something you say on the podcast every day.
Yep.
So why don't you take us right back? This is a COVID story, so let's go back to that time. Where did this all start?
Yeah, you might remember a series of, I suppose Qantas would maybe frame them as bad PR headlines coming out about the airline in that COVID era. And this one is really at the core of that big media storm of the COVID era.
So we're talking right at the beginning of the pandemic, like 2020.
Yep. So COVID-19, we're right in the thick of it, and airlines are losing money rapidly. So borders are closed, flights are cancelled. Every airline is doing it tough. And Qantas in particular claims that it is bleeding cash. They were the words that the carrier used at the time. Now, in November 2020, Qantas made a decision to outsource more than 1,800 ground staff. So we're talking baggage handlers, cleaners, ground crew, all the people who keep the planes and the airports running for Qantas. Now, the company at the time said that this was a cost-saving measure, that it was trying to survive the pandemic, and that by outsourcing these jobs to contractors, it could save about $100 million per year.
And so how do we get from a cost-saving measure during the height of the pandemic to a court case?
So this is where it gets quite interesting and where we start to hear from the Transport Workers Union. Now, this is a major union that represents a lot of the staff that were involved in the sackings. And the union argued that this wasn't just about money. They actually claimed that Qantas deliberately timed these sackings to prevent the workers from exercising their industrial rights. So that included their right to collectively bargain for better wages and conditions, as well as go on strike to demand better wages. The TWWU argued that Qantas deliberately and illegally sacked the workers at a time when they couldn't take any of that kind of action.
Interesting.
And so it launched legal action in the federal court in 2020. Now, in July 2021, Justice Michael Lee, who was the same judge that handed down this week's penalty, he found that Qantas had indeed acted illegally, siding with the TWWU.
A big finding. What were Justice Lee's reasons for getting there?
So he ruled that while Qantas may have had legitimate commercial reasons for outsourcing these staff, that a substantial reason for the decision was to curb the union's bargaining power or to curb staff's ability to exercise their industrial action. Under Australian workplace law, you actually can't sack workers to prevent them from exercising those rights, from doing things like striking. And Justice Lee found that Qantas basically couldn't prove that it wasn't motivated by that factor. So it couldn't prove that it was purely motivated by lawful or financial reasons rather than ones prohibited by the Fair Work Act. Essentially, the burden of proof was on Qantas to show that they weren't trying to weaken the union, and Justice Lee ruled that they couldn't do that.
And so that decision was handed down in 2021. We're now here in the second half of 2025. We're still talking about it. What happened next in the last, I'd say, almost 4 years since then?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Qantas appealed that first decision in the federal court. They actually ended up taking this fight all the way up the court system. So first they appealed to what is known as the full federal court in 2022. 3 judges unanimously there upheld the original ruling against the airline. And then Qantas took its appeal to the High Court. So this is Australia's highest legal authority, the final place of appeal. And in 2023, the High Court unanimously dismissed Qantas's appeal. So that's 3 separate courts, 7 different judges, all finding that Qantas did act illegally by sacking these workers.
And so it went all the way up the court ladder. It was rejected at every stage, and then it almost got sent back down for this sentencing decision or kind of a financial penalty being handed down, which is why we're talking about it today.
Yeah.
So then that's the focus. What was the process in working out exactly how much Qantas needed to pay to remedy this mistake?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
So there were essentially two separate issues that Qantas and the union have been working in the courts to resolve since that point. First, there's this issue of compensation for the workers who lost their jobs. Then, separately, there are the penalties against Qantas for breaking the law. So a twofold issue here. In October last year, Justice Lee in the federal court ordered compensation for the 1,800 affected workers, and the court found that Qantas should compensate them not just for economic losses, like lost wages, but also for non-economic losses, including what the court called hurt and suffering. Now, before landing on a figure, how do you determine, the value of what these 1,800 workers should be awarded? There was a bit of a test case in the federal court. Now, that involved 3 of the impacted workers. These were 3 Qantas staffers aged in their 50s. 2 of them had worked for the company for 20 years, and we heard firsthand from them about what the sacking had done to them mentally, physically, the emotional fallout, relationship fallouts, the whole kind of gamut of negative experiences were on display from those 3 representatives. Justice Lee awarded those ex-Qantas workers a total of $170,000, and that became a sort of blueprint for broader compensation to figure out a scheme that would include all 1,820 workers.
So they had those test cases. They came up with a bit of a figure there. Has that now been resolved, and is every worker going to receive a check for the damage and the lost wages?
Yeah, in short, yes. So in December, based on that case with the 3 workers, Qantas agreed to pay $120 million in total into a compensation fund for all affected former employees. But that still left us with this question of penalties. So, you're going to compensate the workers that you were found to have illegally sacked, but what is the price that you should pay for making that mistake, for breaking the law in that way?
And that's why we're talking about it today. So in that 2-part equation you were talking about earlier of compensating the employees and then the penalties, we're now at that penalties bit.
Yep.
What did Justice Lee rule?
So Justice Lee ordered Qantas to pay $90 million in penalties, and as we've explained, that is on top of the compensation payment that it's required to pay.
So we're now over $200 million.
Exactly. The TWWU was seeking the maximum penalty, which would have been $121 million. Qantas had argued for a mid-range penalty, of course, something between the $40 and $80 million mark. So we were loosely expecting a pretty high figure, but Justice Lee said that he wanted to come up with a number that was going to essentially deter other major corporations from behaving similarly, setting a bit of an example here. And he was pretty scathing about the conduct of the airline. He said that, quote, "To deprive someone of work illegally is to deprive someone of an aspect of their human dignity, and this is not assuaged simply by expressions of regret."
It's pretty strong language from the judge there. Tell me about how he characterized Qantas's behavior, because the focus of this penalty bit is really about assessing their role in this process. And obviously it's worth $90 million in penalties.
Yeah.
How did he describe Qantas as a kind of corporate citizen?
It was really interesting, and Justice Michael Lee is, as you can imagine, a very articulate judge. He was particularly critical of how Qantas handled the case immediately after the outsourcing came to light. He criticised them of a lack of transparency, of kind of a dishonesty with the community about what was going on. And the judge also noted that while the airline did eventually apologise publicly, that it had attempted to deny compensation payments to affected workers, and that it had been, quote, the wrong kind of sorry. So Lee suggested that the remorse shown by Qantas, quote, more likely reflects the damage this case has done rather than unique remorse for the damage done to the affected workers.
Let's get a quick response from the TWU. How have they responded to the penalty?
So the union has said that they're not necessarily happy about this penalty, but that they do welcome it as vindication for workers. Their argument all along has been, we never should have been here having these conversations and the damage has been done. But National Secretary for the union, Michael Caine, described the penalty as a $90 million message to corporate Australia that workers will stand up for what's right. The union has consistently argued throughout this case that the human cost was enormous, the impact on the workers who suffered financially, family breakdowns, mental illness as a result of suddenly losing employment, especially during the early scary stages of the pandemic. Caine also touched on the fact that the Transport Workers Union brought this case and took on a company with, quote, almost limitless resources, knowing it was a long shot. Now, I thought it was interesting that Justice Lee actually acknowledged what the TWU did here, saying that the TWU, quote, has alone borne the burden of prosecuting this litigation. Now, with that in mind, he's actually ordered $50 million of the $90 million that Qantas must pay to be paid to the union. So some of that penalty will go towards the union's legal cost.
And have we heard from the airline in all of this?
So Qantas has accepted the federal court decision. There's a statement from the airline this week that said the judgment holds them accountable for their actions, which caused real harm to employees. We've heard from the group's CEO, Vanessa Hudson, who said the airline apologises to each and every one of the sacked workers and their families. And she added that, quote, over the past 18 months, we've worked hard to change the way we operate to rebuild trust with our people and our customers. This remains our highest priority as we work to earn back the trust we lost.
And so what happens now, Em? I mean, where do we go from here? And I'm interested particularly if any of the money has actually been paid out yet.
Yes. So the airline Qantas has noted that it has paid out that $120 million, but that has gone to a fund that's being managed by the Maurice Blackburn lawyers, the law firm representing all the workers. Now, the law firm is still working to send those individual payments out. It started issuing payments in April this year, but it is a really lengthy process. And the compensation amounts for the workers actually vary. So they're ranging from between $30,000 to $100,000 based on individual circumstances. So the scale of those payments in accordance with the court's orders against the individual circumstances, you can understand why it might continue to be a lengthy one. But the money is in the bank for all intents and purposes from Qantas, and it will pay the penalty from this week in accordance with court orders, according to Qantas.
A really significant employment case that comes to an end after many, many years and many tiers of the court system. Emma, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning. If you enjoyed what you listened to, we'd love you to share it with a friend or leave a comment if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, or watching us on YouTube. We'll be back in the afternoon with your headlines. Until then, have a wonderful day.